Welcome to the Food Revolution Summit, where we explore how you can heal your body and your world with food. This is Ocean Robbins, and I am joined by my dad and colleague, John Robbins, and welcoming our guest, Dr. Dean Ornish. Dr. Dean Ornish is founder of the Preventive Medicine Research Institute, clinical professor of medicine at UCSF, and author of 6 best-selling books, including The Spectrum. Dr. Ornish's 40 years of research has scientifically proven that the lifestyle changes he recommends can improve heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and prostate cancer, and can lengthen telomeres, which begins to reverse aging on a cellular level. The Ornish program was the first lifestyle-based program to be covered in the history of Medicare. Dr. Ornish has been recognized by Life magazine as one of the 50 most influential members of his generation, and by Forbes as one of the 7 most powerful teachers in the world. My dad and I both consider Dr. Ornish to be a treasured friend, as well as one of the great leaders of our times. So now, Dean, we're so glad to have this time with you and for the interview, and I'm going to hand it now to my dad, John Robbins.
Well, thank you, Ocean, and thank you, Dean, for being with us again.
Oh, it's a great pleasure.
You know, as Ocean just alluded to, it's now been nearly 40 years since you and your colleagues famously published a seminal article in the journal Lancet titled, "Can Lifestyle Changes Reverse Coronary Heart Disease?" And that was about the Lifestyle Heart Trial. And for the past 40 years, you've directed clinical research demonstrating the effects that comprehensive lifestyle changes can have on the progression of even severe coronary artery disease without drugs or surgery. So let me begin by asking you, Dean, with the benefit of all these years now of careful research, how strong is the evidence now that lifestyle changes can actually reverse even advanced coronary heart disease?
Well, the evidence is stronger than ever that it can not only reverse heart disease, but a number of other chronic diseases as well. First, let me just say thank you for your kind introduction, and I treasure our friendship as well and all the amazing work you're both doing in the world. And to me, awareness is always the first step in any kind of healing. And so by the way that you're raising awareness through your books and these kinds of interviews is just helping millions of people that you'll probably never meet, but like me will be grateful to you. So thank you for all your hard work and for so many years.
Well, thank you, Dean.
Which continues to inspire me as well. So, the more diseases we study and the more underlying biological mechanisms we look at, the more reasons we have to explain why these simple lifestyle changes are so powerful and how quickly people can not only feel better, but they often are better in ways we can actually measure. And so we've been using these very high-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art scientific measures to prove how powerful these very low-tech and low-cost and often ancient interventions can be for many years. And I think it's because many of these diseases share certain underlying biological mechanisms that are all influenced by these same lifestyle changes, and how dynamic these mechanisms are. And so it really reframes the reason for change from preventing something bad from happening, risk factor reduction, which is really fear-based, to really joy and pleasure, which are really what makes things sustainable. And because these mechanisms are dynamic, when you change your lifestyle, to the degree you change it, most people feel so much better so quickly. It really reframes the whole reason for change from fear or prevention to joy and pleasure, which are really what make it worth doing. And the other part is, for me, that why I'm still so passionate about doing this work after 40 years, is that it enables us to help people when they're suffering, either physically or emotionally or often both, because, say, they've been diagnosed with a life-threatening condition. There's a real opportunity for transformation that goes beyond just transformation of the physical underlying conditions, but to the psychosocial, the emotional, and even the spiritual as well. And so all of this is creating a field that I've been one of the creators of, and you have as well, called lifestyle medicine, which is using lifestyle changes not only to help prevent disease, but actually to treat it and often reverse it. And so it's really, in our program, 4 components. It's a whole foods, plant-based diet that's naturally low both in fat and in refined carbs. So it's not like fat versus carbs. It's really both. It's various meditation and yoga-based stress management techniques, moderate exercise, walking a half an hour a day, for example, and what we call psychosocial support, which is really love and intimacy, or to reduce it even further, to eat well, move more, stress less, and love more. Boom, that's it. And as I said, the more diseases we look at and the more biological mechanisms we study, the more reasons we have to explain why these simple changes are so powerful. And I know there's a lot of interest in what people are calling personalized medicine or precision medicine. And if you're talking about developing a targeted immunotherapy towards a particular cell line of melanoma or pancreatic cancer, that's awesome. But for the vast majority of chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, prostate cancer, breast cancer, autoimmune conditions, changes in gene expression and telomeres and angiogenesis and diabetes and high blood pressure and high cholesterol and obesity, and the real afflictions that are not only epidemic but pandemic in most of the world now, these same simple lifestyle changes are so powerful. And it's not like you have to have one set of lifestyle changes and diet for heart disease, a different one for diabetes, and so on. It's really the same for all of them. And while the genes are a predisposition, they're really not our fate. What I really am trying to do at this stage of my life is to radically simplify this for people and say, it's not that hard. We've done it for 40 years. You can do it too, and here's how.
Well, you mentioned a moment ago that one of the reasons your program is so effective is that people feel so much better so quickly. You have published research that found that 73%, most, of participants with depressive symptoms became non-depressed after only 12 weeks on your program, and that was equally true for both men and women. This reminds me of something the physician Rachel Raymond said, who I know is a friend of yours, and in her beautiful book titled Kitchen Table Wisdom, where she describes the difference between healing and curing. Curing is when the physical disease gets measurably better. Healing is a process of becoming whole. Dean, it seems to me that people who follow your advice, who participate in your programs, who adopt the types of lifestyle changes that you recommend, experience both healing and curing. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's often the case. Rachel's a close friend. She actually married my wife and me. She's my son's and daughter's godmother. She's a true genius of the soul. I wrote the foreword to her Kitchen Table Wisdom book. It's just truly amazing. And she's right, but sometimes you can't always be cured. The mortality rate is still 100%. It's one per person. We're all going to die at some point. But even when we can't be cured in terms of the physical disease getting better, we can be healed in the sense of using the experience of suffering as a way of improving our relationships, of rediscovering, quieting our mind and body down to experience more of an inner sense of peace and joy and well-being. You mentioned depression. We found depression scores in thousands of people we've worked with now are cut in half. But we're not focusing on depression. We're not focusing on weight. We're not focusing on any aspect. We're focusing on the entire picture. And when you do that, and for example, our support groups are ways of bringing people together in ways that are healing, where you can be seen in an authentic way. And I think the real epidemic isn't just, the diseases we've been talking about. It's loneliness and depression and isolation because of the breakdown of the social networks that used to give people a sense of connection and community. 40 years ago when I started doing this work, or you'd say 50 years ago, most people had a neighborhood with 2 or 3 generations of people. They had a church or synagogue they went to regularly. They had an extended family they saw regularly. They had a job that felt secure that they'd been out for 10 years or more, and most of their colleagues had done that. And, study after study have been showing that people who are lonely and depressed are 3 to 10 times more likely to get sick and die prematurely compared to those who have a sense of love and connection and community. And part of the problem is that we've replaced those kinds of communities with things like Facebook, which has, over 1.5 billion members. But the problem there is that it's not authentic. In other words, people post, like you look at your friends or other people's posts and you go, wow, their life seems really a lot better than mine. Why, that seems perfect because they're not posting their anxieties and their fears and where they messed up and what's going on with their friends and family and things that aren't so great. And so people get this very distorted view, which paradoxically makes them feel even more lonely and isolated. Then Avatar, which is one of the most highest grossing films of all time, there's I see you, which is really from an African proverb where I see you. I see all of you, not just your Facebook profile, not just your bio sketch, but, when you grow up in a family with an extended family or 2 or 3 generations of people, they see you grow up. They know where you messed up. You know that they know, and they know that you know that they know, and they're still there for you. And there's just something very primal, that experience of being seen and fully in that way. And so in our support groups, what we do is it's not just helping people stay on the diet. It's about creating a safe environment where people can let down their emotional defenses and just be open and authentic with each other. And it sounds so simple and almost, insipid, and yet it's the most powerful human emotion, is that sense of connection and community. And I think that anything that brings us together is really healing. And in the sense of healing even comes from the root to make whole, and yoga from the Sanskrit to yoke, to unite, union. These are very old ideas that we're rediscovering. And it's our feelings that connect us. And so our support groups, it's not about fixing problems or giving advice. It's about, someone might say, gosh, I might look like the perfect dad, but my kid's on heroin, or, something extreme like that, or maybe not so extreme. And so what we ask people to do is say, what do you feel when someone shares something with you? And express that as a feeling. Because it's our feelings that connect us. So somebody might, instead of saying, oh, why don't you send them to a drug rehab program, like they had thought of that, which only makes you feel more isolated, to say, gosh, I feel so sad to hear that, or gosh, I used to have a drug problem, they might say, or gosh, my kid has another problem, or whatever it happens to be. And it doesn't change the fact that the first kid has this heroin problem, but it changes everything about how you feel about that. And it's so meaningful for people to have that sense of community that even if our program is like 9 weeks long, sometimes decades later, they're still meeting with each other because these bonds are so precious and so healing.
Well, you're talking about healing, really, in a very deep sense, healing from loneliness and isolation and depression, healing into connection and community, and with the recognition that our feelings connect us. And this reminds me of a study. It was in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it looked at the health outcomes and the social ties of 5,000 adults over something like 35 years. And the researchers found that if one sibling became obese during the study, the chances that another sibling of that same person would become obese increased by 40%. Now, the researchers thought, well, that could be attributable to the fact that siblings share certain genes. But then the researchers noticed that the same pattern occurred in marriages. If a spouse became obese, then the odds of their partner also becoming obese shot up dramatically. And they thought, well, that could be the result of the fact that spouses often share meals and lifestyle habits. But apparently, there's still more to it, because the study also found that if participants had a close friend who became obese, the odds in the study of that participant herself becoming obese rose by a stunning 60%.
Well, it's actually even more than that. That was Nicholas Christakis' study that came out about 10 years ago.
Yes.
In the New England Journal. And they found that we are so, we were already interconnected. And so what we try to do is to use that as a healing force. And what Nicholas found was that if your friends are obese, you're 45% more likely to be obese yourself. Not so surprising. But if your friend's friends are obese, you're 25% more likely to be obese. And if your friend's friend's friend is obese, you're 10% higher, even if you've never met them. And that's how interconnected we are.
It's astounding.
And so for me, as I get older, I'm 64 now, although I don't feel old at all. I feel like I'm just, beginning. Is that I'm more interested in why I got interested in this in the first place. I was suicidally depressed when I was in college, and we talked about that in one of our earlier interviews, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But the worst thing to think about being depressed is that you really think you're seeing things clearly for the first time. I learned that I could take all the meaning out of things. Who cares? Why bother? So what? Nothing matters. All that kind of nihilistic stuff. And it is a reality distortion field in the sense that you really think that you're seeing things clearly for the first time, that things are bad, they'll always be bad, and anytime you ever thought otherwise, you were just fooling yourself. That's where that helplessness and hopelessness come from, which are really the hallmarks of depression. And so that was my doorway into learning about these things. I learned through an ecumenical teacher named Swami Satchidananda, and he taught me that I was looking in the wrong places for my health and happiness and well-being. And if you told me back then that I was going to live longer if I just, went on a plant-based diet or whatever, I'd say, you don't get it. I'm just trying to get through the day. And so many people are just trying to get through the day. The opioid epidemic is just one of many examples of that. The obesity epidemic, people use food to fill that void, or they say, I've got 20 friends in this pack of cigarettes, or they work all the time, or they play video games, just ways of numbing themselves or distracting themselves from this pain that people carry around. And so what I'm most interested in, it's kind of our conspiracy of love here, is to say, where does our peace of mind come from? Where does our health really come from?
Where does our peace of mind, where does our health really come from? Those are great questions. You said a moment ago that your depression and your helplessness became doorways for you into learning about health and happiness and well-being. And that the ecumenical teacher, Swami Satchidananda, helped you to go through that doorway. What else did you learn from him?
What I learned from the Swami is that our peace of mind is there already. Our health is there already. And perhaps the ultimate irony in my limited experience is that not being aware or mindful of that, we think, if only I could get it outside, then I'd be happy. And in the process of running after things that we think are going to bring us a sense of peace and well-being, we end up disturbing what's already there if we just stop doing it. And the Swami liked to make puns. People would say, "What are you, a Hindu?" He'd say, "No, I'm an undu," and the idea is that when you quiet down your mind and body through meditation, for example, at least for temporarily, you're not disturbing what's already there. And it allows you to experience that. And then it's incredibly empowering, because if I have to get my sense of peace and health from outside myself, then everyone and everything that has something I think I need has power over me. But if it comes down to what am I doing to disturb my own inner peace and health, not to blame myself, but to empower myself, I can do something about that. And then the suffering becomes a doorway. It becomes like as Rachel Remen said, our wounds are our windows, our doorways to the soul. It becomes a catalyst for transforming our lives, because change is hard. But if you're in enough pain, the idea of change becomes more appealing. When I was in Texas and I was so depressed, 40, 50 years ago, and the Swami said, try all these things. I figured, well, what have I got to lose? I'll kill myself, move that to plan B. Let me try this weird stuff. You'll try things when you're suffering, because it's like, it's got to be better than what I'm feeling now. And then because these underlying biological mechanisms are so dynamic, most people feel so much better so quickly, not just physically with the chest pain and the angina getting better, but the depression and other things getting better. Then they often say things like, having a heart attack was a blessing in disguise, and it got my attention in ways that I might not have done these things otherwise, that it made my life so much better.
Dean, I think the fact that our suffering can be a doorway to the soul is really profound, that our pain can become a catalyst for transforming our lives. I love that, because I don't like to see pain have the last word. If we can use our pain to activate some new growth path, then the pain wasn't in vain, then it served a higher purpose. I remember something the Swiss writer Hermann Hesse once wrote, that God doesn't send us to spare to destroy us, but to awaken new life in us. Dean, you were saying that when we quiet our minds and bodies through meditation, for example, it's empowering because it allows us to experience inner peace and to know that we don't have to acquire peace from outside ourselves. What else happens when we quiet our minds?
The other thing that happens when you quiet your mind down is that you begin to hear your own inner wisdom, your own inner voice, that still small voice within that speaks very quietly but very clearly, and it gets drowned out by the chatter of everyday life most of the time. It's the one that wakes you up at 3 in the morning and says, "Hey, Dean, listen up, pay attention, you're not doing something that's in your best interest," or, "Hey, here's the answer to that problem you've been struggling with." I mean, most of the research I've done came from that place, and then kind of reverse engineer to see if we could, prove that in an objective way. And I've learned to trust that voice. And so at the end of a meditation, I'll usually ask myself to let that voice, to listen to it, and to say, what am I not paying attention to that I need to, and how can I hear that voice better? I learned to really trust it.
I love questions like that. I often ask myself, what am I doing that's blocking the flow of love in my life? I try to ask empowering questions like you are, questions that help me hear the voice of my inner guidance. But when I'm emotionally upset, that's more difficult. So what I want to ask you is, have you had people in your groups who were so caught up in anger or resentment that it was harming their health?
On the very first day of my first study, we had a guy who was a homophobic dentist and another guy who was gay, and they started yelling at each other, and they both got chest pain, and I thought they were both going to have heart attacks and die. This was going to be the end of my very short research career. And I explained to them that when you hate somebody, and anger is the most toxic emotion for your heart of all the emotions, chronic anger and hostility, that you have one finger pointing at someone else, you have 3 pointing back at you. It hurts you. It's like someone, I saw a bumper sticker recently. It's like taking poison trying to hurt the other person. It hurts you. And so when we're loving and compassionate and forgiving, not for some external reward down the road, but rather this is what frees us from our suffering right here and right now. Like Nelson Mandela, when he did his long walk to freedom after being in jail for 16 years, he was asked, "Do you hate your jailers?" He said, "Well, they took away the best years of my life, but if I hate them, then I'm still in prison in my heart." And so what I'm most interested in is how we can use the experience of suffering as a doorway for really transforming our lives.
It seems to me that the lifestyle practices you advocate can help us do just that. They can help us use our suffering for growth and healing. And of course, these practices have been proven now to reverse heart disease and also to prevent many, many other forms of illness and help to heal them. Have you found also that these practices help us to live a more joyful, even more sensually rich way of life?
This is the way to live the juiciest, most pleasurable, the most erotic, the most fun kind of life. And if it's not pleasurable, it's not sustainable. It's like, why bother if you're not enjoying it? And make it really aspirational. If it's meaningful, it's also sustainable. And, when we imbue those, when I was in college, I could take all the meaning out of something, as we talked about. But I also learned that when you choose not to do certain things, not to eat certain foods, or just the act of choosing not to do something that you could otherwise do, and imbue that with meaning. And if it's meaningful, then it's sustainable. So all of which is to say that for the people listening to this, to say that what we're really talking about is not just going on a diet. It's really about how can we lead a life in ways that make it the most fun, the most juicy, the most erotic, the most pleasurable. And what's good for you is good for the planet too, as it turns out, in ways that you've written about. And then that, to me, is what ultimately makes this sustainable. And that's why, even though our program, which now Medicare and other insurance companies are paying for, is 9 weeks long, a year later, 85 to 90% of the people are still following it throughout the country because it's pleasurable, and that makes it meaningful, and that in turn makes it sustainable.
As you've been talking about suffering as a doorway, I've been thinking about how our suffering really does get our attention, and how ironic it is, to me at least, that your work seems these days to be finding a new resonance among the millennials. And these are people who aren't typically concerned about preventing heart disease, but they are dealing now with a great deal of emotional pain.
Yes.
The American Psychological Association tells us that 18 to 34-year-olds report higher levels of loneliness and stress than any other age group, and that anxiety disorders affect nearly a fifth of those in that group. Dean, I think one of the reasons your work is catching on with millennials is that you don't focus on the fear of dying, but on the joy of living and pleasure and feeling good.
And also a sense of meaning. I think millennials, just like when I was in that age and was ready to kill myself. And when I say ready to kill myself, I was about as close to doing it as you can do without actually doing it. So I'm saying that to give voice to that, because a lot of people, there's still a stigma around that. And I just want to encourage people to reach out and not to have to get a gun and start shooting up schools or whatever it is, but to really, reach out to people. And I think millennials, because, these things, the technology that was supposed to bring us together often isolates us even more. You have two people sitting next to each other texting, someone else, instead of just talking to each other. Or as we talked about earlier, that, Facebook makes you feel like, why don't I have this perfect life like everyone else does? So, but on the other hand, it's so easy to feel overwhelmed, like what can I do as one person with global warming or with the fact there's so many hungry people in the world. I was on the board of the San Francisco Food Bank years ago, and 1 out of 5 people in the Bay Area goes to bed hungry, and we're very prosperous. This isn't, Bangladesh, this is San Francisco. This is true throughout the country. What can I do about hunger? What can I do about global warming? What can I do about healthcare costs, And it turns out that all these things intersect around what we choose to eat every day. As you were writing about this before most people, John, that it takes, 10 to 14 times more resources to make a pound of animal-based protein than plant-based protein. There's enough food to feed everyone. No one needs to go hungry if everybody were eating more towards the plant-based end of the spectrum. So if you choose to say, okay, I'm not ready to be a vegetarian, you might say, I'll have a meatless Monday, whatever. So to the degree that you're doing that, you're freeing up resources to feed the hungry. More global warming is caused by livestock consumption than all forms of transportation combined. So I can help with global warming as well. And 86% of the $3.2 trillion we spent last year on healthcare costs, just in the U.S., which are really mostly sick care costs, are for treating chronic diseases that are often preventable or even reversible through changing diet and lifestyle in the same way. So I think that millennials are really finding that they're looking for meaning. They're looking that when they can choose certain behaviors, like what I eat every day, that it imbues those choices with meaning, and then it makes it much more fun and sustainable.
Some authorities are saying that mass starvation will be our fate, humanity's fate, if we keep flogging the land to death, that we have to change our diets before it's too late, and that a singularly powerful step we could take would be to swap beef for beans. They're saying that if we did that, if we ate beans instead of beef, our health would improve dramatically, and so would the health of our world.
Well, what's good for you is good for the planet. What's personally sustainable is globally sustainable. There's a great scene in this Game Changers movie that's coming out that James Cameron did. That there's a urologist named Aaron Spitz in Southern California, and he got 3 athletes, and they're probably in their mid-20s, really manly men. And he fed them a plant-based meal, and he fed them a meat-based meal, and he measured how many erections they had at night, and how frequent they were, and how hard they were. And he found, and I've been writing for years that even a single meal, a high-fat meat-based meal, can reduce blood flow to your heart or to your brain, but he found something that's much more motivating for people, that the people, so he fed them a meat-based meal, and it was, grass-fed beef and organic chicken and pork and so on. Just one meal in a burrito. And then at night they put this thing on that measured how frequently and how hard their erections were, and they did the same thing with a plant-based meal and did the same thing. And he found they had like 300 to 500% more frequent erections and 10% or so harder reactions, 10 to 15% harder, just from a plant-based meal compared to the meat-based meal. Now, the film crew apparently became vegan after shooting that. But again, it goes to the heart in every sense of the word of, why would I want to eat this way? Am I going to be a wimp if I eat a plant-based diet? Well, in fact, the athletes started to say, I used to see a guy come into a restaurant and eat a salad. I thought, oh, that guy's a wimp. And then see a guy ordering a manly meal and a steak, and that guy's really hard, and, that's why I want to be. And he said, I got it all wrong. It was just the other way around.
If what we're eating is affecting our genitals and affecting our hearts, it must also be affecting our brains.
Your brain gets more blood when you eat healthfully. You can actually grow so many new brain neurons. Through a process of neurogenesis, your brain can get measurably bigger, and in just a few weeks. Your face gets more blood, so you don't age as quickly. Your heart gets more blood. Your sexual organs get more blood. And so as we learn how dynamic these mechanisms are, it completely changes and helps people motivate. Like if you're a millennial and you tell somebody, I've got a 17-year-old son, and I say, eat healthier, you'll live longer. He goes, they feel like they're immortal when they're 17. And if you say something's bad for you, like riding a motorcycle, that just makes it cool. That's why motorcycles are cool, because they're dangerous, But if you say, hey, you're going to be, have much better sex if you eat healthier, that's a lot more motivating people, and it puts it much more in, it's not about just living longer, it's about living, not just how long we live, it's also how well we live.
When you were talking about the making of the Game Changers film and measuring men's erections, how hard they were, how frequent they were, depending on what they had eaten, I found myself wondering if the same thing would hold true for women in some way, that getting ample blood flow to the genitals would feed and provide for greater and more pleasurable sexual experience regardless of the gender.
Well, certainly anecdotally, I hear that a lot from patients, and their sexual function improves, their orgasmic function improves, their brain gets more blood. They feel like they say things like, I feel like I've been walking around in a fog. I feel like I'm waking up. There's studies showing that this may reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. So, like I say, the more diseases we study and the more biological mechanisms we look at, the more reason we have to explain why these simple changes are so powerful. It's hard for many people to believe that something as simple as, eat well, move more, stress less, love more, could make such a difference in so many different areas, but they do. And that's what's really empowering when people realize that.
Congressman Tim Ryan from Ohio says that after 15 years in the United States Congress, he believes that there's nothing on the political agenda that can unite us as a country across the partisan divides, like acknowledging the damage our current food system is doing to the health and well-being of our people and our nation. Now, I know that former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich and former President Bill Clinton both became very strong supporters of your research and friends of yours. Dean, do you think we might be able to come together as a society around having a food system that supports human health?
Well, I hope so. I mean, our country's never been more polarized as a nation, and certainly in Congress. But I think that the fact that Bill Clinton when he was president, Newt Gingrich when he was Speaker of the House, we had 20 members of the Senate, 30 members of the House across the political spectrum, all came together around getting Medicare to cover our program. took 16 years. It was the hardest thing I ever did. I had no idea. I mean, you'd think that if the President of the United States and the Speaker of the House call Medicare and say, hey, this is a good thing, they're the head of the executive branch, Medicare's in the executive branch, I figured that, that'll happen really quick. And boy, was I wrong. But they did it, and it's a game changer, no pun intended, because, I used to think that good science was enough to change medical practice. And through my nonprofit Preventive Medicine Research Institute in the 90s, we trained 53 hospitals and clinics around the country. And we got bigger changes, in lifestyle, as I mentioned, bigger cost savings, better adherence, et cetera. And a number of the sites closed down because we didn't have the reimbursement. And so that's what set me on the 16 years journey to get the reimbursement, but we did. And I think that these things really do transcend ideology. These are just profoundly human issues. Everybody wants their kids to do well. Everybody wants their loved ones to avoid getting sick or to have less. I mean, there's a convergence of forces now, even more than ever, that finally, after 40 years, makes this the right idea at the right time.
I would hope that creating a healthy and safe food system and a healthy way of life would transcend partisan ideologies, particularly when we have so much evidence now that the kinds of food choices and lifestyle practices that you advocate are so much more effective in preventing heart attacks than the routine use of stents and angioplasties.
There are all these randomized trials, or at least 8 randomized trials that have shown that in stable patients with heart disease, stents and angioplasties really don't work. They don't prolong life. They don't prevent heart attacks. In the latest study, which came out in the Lancet a few months ago, I don't know how they got this through the Human Studies Committee. They did it in England. They probably would never have been able to do it here. They randomized people who had heart disease into 2 groups. And one, they did an actual angioplasty and stent, and the other, they did a fake angioplasty and stent. They put the tube in there, but they didn't put the stent in there. And they found that there was no difference really between the groups. And the same is true with men who have early-stage prostate cancer. There was a major study that came out in the New England Journal a little over a year ago, that after 10 years, men who had early-stage prostate cancer who did nothing lived as long as those who had surgery or radiation, even though they often get maimed in the most personal ways because now they're impotent and they can't have sex, or they're incontinent and wearing diapers, and for no benefit. Now, there's a smaller subset of people who really do need surgery or radiation, maybe 1 out of 49 or 50 people. And Dr. Peter Carroll, who's the chair of urology at UCSF, who I collaborated with on this, we did a randomized trial along with Dr. Bill Fair, who at the time was the chair of urology at Sloan Kettering in New York. When you're trying to do disruptive research, it's good to work with people who are so well respected. And he's one of the busiest, Dr. Carroll's one of the busiest surgeons in the country, but he also has developed algorithms to kind of identify who is that 1 out of 49 or 50 men who actually need surgery or radiation, and then do that. But for the others, if you just say don't do anything, just watchful waiting, most guys want to do something if they know they have a tumor growing inside them, even if the treatment is worse than the disease. So we can offer people a third alternative, which is the same lifestyle intervention, which we found in this randomized trial could slow, stop, and even reverse the progression of men with early-stage prostate cancer, and by extension, in all likelihood, women with early-stage breast cancer.
Speaking about prostate cancer, the World Cancer Research Fund says that the more dairy products men consume, the more likely they are to get prostate cancer.
What's worse than that is that they're more likely to have prostate cancer that kills them, that spreads. There was an article that came out where they found that a high-fat diet really fuels the spread of prostate cancer. This came out from the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston that was in Nature Genetics, which is one of Harvard's main teaching hospitals. And they found that they tended to spread mostly if they had a ready source of high fat in the diet. So again, it's just another example of that. And then the same is true of type 2 diabetes. We have this epidemic of diabetes that $322 billion in the U.S. alone were spent on diabetes. And yet the studies are showing that getting your blood sugar down with drugs doesn't prevent the horrible complications of diabetes nearly as well as getting them down with diet and lifestyle, both in treating and preventing it. So I think that's why there's a convergence of forces that I think more and more people are finding that this really is the right idea at the right time. And again, it's not that drugs and surgery don't have their place. We've all been the beneficiary of those, but it's using them when they're most appropriate and finding and really treating the cause of these. Otherwise, when you get put on drugs to lower your cholesterol or your blood pressure, your blood sugar, and you say, doctor, how long do I have to take these? They say, forever. It's like, but if you change the cause of it, most people are finding under their doctor's supervision, that they can reduce or often get off these medications, which is incredibly empowering and making you feel like you're actually getting well instead of have this chronic disease.
I want to ask you about something. We have a lot of anti-carb rhetoric now. It's been around for a long time, but it's gotten fierce these past few years. There are many bestsellers blaming carbs for really every disease under the sun. And part of the difficulty, I think, is that everything from lentils to lollipops is a source of carbs.
Right.
So what I want to ask you, Dean, is, are carbs the problem, or is the problem actually the type of carbs we have been eating, mostly refined wheat, flour, and sugar?
Well, it's as you know, it's the latter. And, you know, I debated Dr. Atkins a number of times before he died. It turned out he died of heart failure. And so I'm tired of all these diet wars. You know, I stopped doing those kind of debates because I think that if you really get a lot of thoughtful people together, David Katz and Walter Willett from Yale and Harvard, respectively, brought together a bunch of us 2 years ago to say, like, can't we all get along here? You know, I brought the paleo people and the vegans and everybody in between. And we actually did come to a consistent, more of a congruence of opinion than you might expect. And the idea, it goes something like this, you know, eat mostly plants, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, soy products in their natural, unrefined form. Avoid the bad carbs, as you put it, the sugar and white flour and white rice. And the reason is that when you go from a good carb like brown rice to a bad carb like white rice, or from whole wheat flour to white flour, you're removing the fiber in the bran. And the fiber in the bran, first, they fill you up before you get to many calories. You can only eat so many apples, you're going to get full before you get to many calories. But you can consume virtually unlimited amounts of sugar or white flour or white rice, whatever. And because you've removed the fiber in the bran, which not only fill you up, but they slow the rate of absorption from your gut into your blood, then you get these wide swings in your blood sugar that causes, when your blood sugar spikes up, then the insulin surges come out, and over time the insulin surges on the receptor level cause your receptors to downregulate. It's kind of like the boy who cried wolf. It's like, oh, not more insulin. So your receptors kind of stop listening to it. And that's what leads to metabolic syndrome and even type 2 diabetes. It's not that people with type 2 diabetes don't have enough insulin, which is what most people think. They actually have more than most people do, but their body's not really responding to it. It's become insulin resistant. But we find that when you eat a lot of good carbs, your insulin receptors wake up and they begin to function again. That's why almost invariably people with type 2 diabetes are able to reduce or even get off insulin altogether when they make these kinds of changes. And you know, the number one cause of death in diabetes is heart disease. So it's the same diet and lifestyle.
What I'm hearing here, Dean, is that eating good carbs, healthy carbs, actually helps to reverse metabolic syndrome and actually helps to heal insulin resistance. And these are conditions that are caused by eating bad carbs. And I think similarly, there are good fats and bad fats.
The omega-3 fatty acids in moderation are really good for you. The trans fats and the saturated fats are not. And so the diet that I recommend it's optimally, to the degree you can move in this direction. And again, it's not all or nothing, but to the degree you can reduce the amount of bad carbs and eat more good carbs in the way they come in nature. And there's literally hundreds of thousands of protective substances in fruits and vegetables that have anti-cancer, anti-heart disease, anti-aging properties. Reduce your amount of the bad fats in the ways that we're talking about. But also to get past this whole fat versus carbs, you know, animal protein itself, there's increasing evidence that it's really harmful, independent of the whole fat versus carbs debate. And studies have shown that diets high in animal protein, there's a 75% higher risk of premature death from all causes, and a 400 to 500% increased risk of premature death from diabetes and from most forms of cancer. In part because they may be inflammatory, you know, interleukins and other things that are inflammatory markers go up and so on. But it's clear that that's the case. And so, you know, I'm writing a new book now, which is really just to make things really radically simple. You know, look, we've been doing this work for 40 years. It works. Here's how you do it. It's not that hard. And it's not all or nothing. To the degree you do it, there's a corresponding benefit. You know, that's it.
When you're talking about how dangerous animal protein can be, I'm thinking about soy foods. I routinely include minimally processed soy foods in my diet, like tofu, tempeh.
Yeah, me too.
You do too.
Uh-huh.
And how do you feel about soy products as part of a healthful eating plan for people?
I think that in moderation, they can be, great sources of protein. The reason I've spent 40 years doing well-controlled randomized trial research is that there's so much stuff out there that people, want to believe that just happens not to be true. And there's all this whole thing about like soy is bad for you. It's not bad for you. I mean, the issue around soy is that soy is a phytoestrogen, which means it looks enough like estrogen, so it'll bind to an estrogen receptor. But it's kind of like putting a key in a lock that'll go in the lock, but it won't open it. But it keeps the regular key from going in that does. And so the net effect of soy is actually to reduce the amount of estrogen because you're blocking the regular estrogen molecules from it's only weakly stimulating it, but you're blocking the regular estrogen from binding to it. And estrogen tends to stimulate cell growth and proliferation, which unchecked can lead to cancer. And so if you get a tremendous amount of soy, you theoretically could get too much of an estrogen-like effect. But for most people, the net effect is actually to reduce your estrogen because it's blocking the regular estrogen molecules from binding to the receptors there.
Some people are concerned that soy and other beans contain lectins and that can create inflammation, and phytates that can impair mineral absorption.
That kind of stuff, this heart surgeon that's out there spreading this stuff, it's just criminal to me. It's like there's no evidence at all for these things. We measure inflammatory markers in our studies. We find that C-reactive protein goes down, that SED rates go down, that interleukins show improved profiles, that are measures of inflammation. So it's just, people like to, unfortunately, the media are really hurting these days, especially magazines and newspapers because of the internet. And they love controversy. In fact, even medical journals love controversy. They have this thing called the impact factor, like the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA have among the highest, and Lancet among the highest impact factors and it's really based to a large degree on how much your article that's published in there gets picked up in the media and makes headlines. And so if you write an article that saturated fat isn't bad for you or butter's good for you, that tells people what they want to hear. They put it on the cover of a magazine. It sells a lot of magazines, I understand it, but it's unfortunate, and it's unfortunately confusing with people in a lot of ways that really are to everyone's disadvantage. But if you actually look at the evidence in its aggregate, there is a consensus that an optimal diet is a whole foods plant-based diet that's naturally low in fat and refined carbs, and as close to as it comes in nature as you can.
Dean, a famous poet once said, "Be patient towards all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves."
Love that quote.
What questions are you living with these days?
I also like the quote from Thoreau where he said, consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. So nobody's perfect, and we all have our stuff, including and especially me. But the questions that I'm interested in now are the ones we've been talking about, and we just started a randomized trial to see if we can reverse the progression of early-stage Alzheimer's disease, which would be really fun. And we've been training hospitals and clinics and physician groups around the country now that we have Medicare and many other insurance companies paying for this. And we're really creating this whole new paradigm of healthcare. We partnered with a company called ShareCare to do that. And it's working, It's saving, we're cutting healthcare costs in half within 9 weeks. It's not like you have to wait years to see the benefits. So that's been really fun. And trying to spend more time with my friends and family, we tend to think that the time we spend with our loved ones is an indulgence you do, a luxury after you've done all the important stuff. And I think what all these studies teach us in terms of raising our awareness again is that, people who are lonely and depressed, as we talked about earlier, are 3 to 10 times more likely to get sick and die prematurely compared to those who have a sense of love and connection and community. And I don't know anything that has that kind of powerful benefit. So I really make a point of spending more time in that way. And, I'm also just trying to develop more of a beginner's mind to look at things. I think great art or great science or great, music, great lovemaking, great anything is the ability to see without preconceptions and to be open to, all possibilities and all degrees of freedom and to try to see the same thing from as many different perspectives as possible, because no paradigm, no model, no system has a monopoly on truth. And so, but it can be sometimes hard to see things from a lot of different perspectives because there's a sense of order that's provided by a paradigm, and sometimes when you see things differently, it challenges that order and it can be threatening to people. But I just found that the more ways I can view the world, the more paradigms and more systems I can see things through, the closer I can come to that, what really is true, and to really trust that process.
Well, there are so many things I appreciate about you, Dean, and about your work. your knowledge, your wisdom, your heartfelt compassion. I see you as a healer of the heart, of people's individual hearts, of the pumps beating in their chests, but also the greater heart that guides us all and inspires us to be our better selves and to love one another. It's a joy for me to know you as a friend and a colleague. And on behalf of Ocean and myself and of everyone involved in the food revolution, I thank you for your decades of tireless and wonderful work, and of course for being with us today.
Oh, well, right back at you both. And like I say, you're doing so much to raise awareness, and I offer a deep bow to you for all that you're doing and all the people that you're helping. And I hope that at least in some way this has been helpful to your listeners. If there's interested in learning more about our work, just go to ornish.com. Everything on there is free. And let me know when you're back up in the Bay Area, in the Marin County area. We'd love to get together.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've been talking here with Dr. Dean Ornish, founder of the Preventive Medicine Research Institute and author of 6 bestsellers, including Dr. Dean Ornish's program for reversing heart disease and The Spectrum. Dean, you are world-renowned for your work improving human health. And at the end of the day, I think your impact on human happiness may be every bit as profound.
Well, thank you. One begets the other.
It does. It's hard to be truly happy if you're in great pain. And it's hard to enjoy your health if your heart isn't filled with love. We're so grateful for the lives you're touching, for your keen science-driven inquiry, and for the depth of heart that imbues all you do. It's such a privilege to be your friend and your colleague, and we thank you for your partnership in this food revolution.
Thank you. Right back at you.